Well, I hope I can live up to the introduction, George, because I always had a hard time keeping up with you on any sort of analysis, I've got to say. So I didn't bring as much physics into this lecture as I'd like because I'm not very competent at putting together a slide presentation on a combination of physics diagrams. So I'll just have to talk to a little bit of physics as we go, because I don't know how many people are really interested in physics here and how many people are really interested in climbing. I'm sort of really interested in both. So to start out, just to give you a perspective, this is rock climbing in Indian Creek in southern Utah a few years ago with the International Climbers Meet. And you sort of get a perspective of how you can start using physics, because if you look at the way my hand is in that crack, it's a little bit overhanging as you look at it, but if you simply make your hand into a wedge, you increase the normal forces on the sides of the crack. And of course, when you increase the normal forces, you can pull a lot harder on it, and you can cam your hand in the crack as well and just take a mechanical advantage. So all of climbing is just what you get in engineering physics in the first semester, basically, and you have to apply it. You want to obviously keep your center mass in, but if you'll also notice up there that I've got a leg stuck out on a little tiny protuberance here, and that's pushing me hard against the rock here so I don't slide out of the crack backwards as well. So again, that increases the normal force. That means that I'm not going to slide down the rock quite as rapidly. And so it's really a pretty simple phenomenon that goes on in climbing, and this is really what you're using. You want to keep that center of gravity as close into the rock as possible, as you don't want to pull too hard. And so climbing is really pretty simple, and you'll find a lot of climbers who are basically geeks like me, because that's the place where they can apply their skills in both disciplines. So we'll go on to when I was in undergraduate school, I was doing undergraduate climbing. And this is a little bit in Little Cottonwood Canyon. When I first came here I was going to school in California for a couple of years and moved to Utah. Wasn't quite prepared for Harvey mud when I went down there because I didn't learn good enough study habits. And coming from Ogden High School wasn't a great place either in terms of having a shop teacher for your physics teacher. But coming here was great because good department, learned an enormous amount here, and I'm really appreciative of that. And it's a great place to go climbing. And I'm not sure which came first, to be honest. And the interesting thing about living in Salt Lake is it's in the mountains, and as soon as you get out on the rock, you can run into unexpected circumstances, and the coefficient of friction is a lot lower in this particular environment than it is when you're climbing on dry rock. So for all these eventualities. My first introduction. In 1965, when I went to Europe for the summer, I wasn't quite committed to the Cosmic Ray Group at that point in time, so I decided to take the summer off and spend it in Europe, and was very fortunate to run into a bunch of British climbers, including a guy named Chris Jones that I did a lot of climbing with in subsequent years. This is on an attempt on the second ascent. The central pillar of Frene. This is a Frene icefall, and to give you some idea, that's about a 200 meter high wall of ice there. And we got to very high on this pillar, somewhere right around here, trying to make the second ascent. And so I was fortunate to fall in with a group of people where I learned very, very rapidly about what was essential to stay alive in the alpine environment. And one of these things it's just like trying to do physics. You can't do partial differential equations solving the Schrödinger equation your first year in college usually. Now that may not be true of a lot of the students coming in now, fortunately, but in those days it was. And so climbing is very much the same way. You're not likely to stay alive in climbing. The penalty is a little bit more severe than getting a bad grade in the class. But I learned a lot, decided that when you're a student in college, you can't go to Europe very often, so I started winter mountaineering in the Tetons. And it's the time when not much had been done. The equipment has changed a little bit since those days. Here we made the first winter ascent of Mount Owen in 1965, still doing my undergraduate studies. And then about the time I graduated, it was time to move on to a little bit bigger rocks to climb on. And so for my first trip to Yosemite in 1967, when I was in graduate school, and getting by, but maybe not doing as well as I might have because I was gone a little bit more than I probably should have been. Climbing on places like Middle Cathedral Rock, and this is actually on the next picture's on this route. And once again, you see physics and application. You can see I don't have as much normal force as I'd like in that particular case because this is the only hold that's available on this friction slab, and so you have a force that moves in this way, and I'm pushing out that way, and another one out this way. It gets a little bit complex keeping track of all what's going on, but I am barely managed to hang on in that particular case. But again, it's very simple. If you can keep your center of gravity so it doesn't go beyond your feet, that's really good because you're not putting as much, you're not having to work so hard, and it's terribly important to conserve your energy, but you also want to stay on the rock. And from there, in 1968, I was in graduate school, and I decided better enter graduate school in mountaineering as well, and the north face of the Grand Teton was still unclimbed in the winter. And a group of four of us, my two cousins, Greg and Mike Lowe, who are nearly as crazy as I am, decided we better go try to do this, and we joined up with a guy named Rick Horn from Jackson to try to attempt the north face of the Grand Teton in the winter, and you sort of go up through this area here. And that was a big unknown in the time, and one of the nice things for rehearsing for the bigger climbs around the world is simply the fact that you can go to a place like the Tetons and actually experience almost Himalayan conditions, certainly colder and probably windier. So it was really a great training experience. And again, it's that critical building in your skill set before you try something that's too hard. Learn about how well snow caves insulate. Lots of air in the snow, especially in the dry, cold environments. You can stay very, very warm in a snow cave despite the fact the outside temperatures are high, are very low. And we built some of our own gear, like you can see the special gaiters that we built ourselves, because none of this stuff was available at the time. That sort of was the start of low alpine systems as well, because that's what my cousins were involved with. Climbing some relatively low angle mixed snow, and in the winter, it's not warm enough. You actually get ice on the north face of the Grand Teton. It's mostly snow plastered over the rock because the temperature is too low for any melting. And finally up to Greg Lowe leading the pendulum pitch right up at the top of the Grand Teton, and the group of four of us on summit. And we actually had beautiful weather, George. I hate to contradict your comments. And from there, continuing my graduate education in both aspects, and perhaps not being as good a student here as I might have been, I tried to work hard at both the work and the play, and I think that's the key to coming out reasonably well on both. I went down with my cousin Jeff Lowe, who had just barely gotten out of high school, to try the fifth descent of the Salotay Wall on El Capitan in Yosemite. And here we're starting at the lower part of El Cap. This is about 1,000 meters high of a pretty vertical rock, as you can see. It's supposed to be the best rock climb in the world. And it was just a great experience. But the problem is we were using really antiquated gear. I had what they call a gold line rope, which was the old type of rope. And when you loaded it, when you fell, it was kind of nice because it stretched a lot. But when you tried to go up it with one of these devices that slides up but not down a rope called an ascender, it stretches a lot there too. And so you'll be working your way up the rope for quite some time before you actually get off the ground. But we managed, and here's Jeff sitting on the ledge looking quite young. Jeff has probably been one of the world's foremost alpinists in the last 30 or 40 years. Great climbing companion, and we really got along well. I think he's been one of my best companions over the years. Getting very high on the Salotay Wall, probably about 900 meters off the ground here. Lots of good exposure. You have to do the sort of horizontal traverse on the roof, and you can actually see I'm not using my own body to keep myself in place. I've got some aid slings on underneath, and in those days we were driving these old pitons into the rock and destroying the rock, and of course we were pretty blissfully unaware of this at the time. Fortunately, that has gone away, where we're using camming devices, which do a much better job of applying less way of damaging way of applying physics to the problem. From there, continuing that graduate education in 1970, Jeff and I decided we'd better go up and try some climbs in the Canadian Rockies, sort of expanding our horizons a little bit. And we made an attempt on the north face of Temple, which had not been climbed at the time, following this route up here. And then the sort of dicey part is here where you get to the ice cliff at the top. Fortunately, the rib here sticks out enough, except for when you do a very quick running traverse across these ledges, that you're not exposed to falling ice from the glacier above. And Jeff was a joy to climb with. We zoomed up the face. It's about 1,500 meters or so high. It's a pretty big face. And you can look down on the ridge where we've been climbing and see how much it sticks out. And really quite nice limestone in places and good quartzite. And then on to the summit ice cap. Well, ice tools weren't quite so sophisticated then. We had some ice pitons where we bought some electrical conduit and cut it into lengths and then just pounded it into the ice because we didn't have enough money. As a graduate student, you know how it is, to buy everything. But we did have a couple of good tools and you can see once again, Jeff is using a little bit of direct aid where he's standing in his slings to move upward, and then you simply take out the piece below you, and he's eventually heading for that the ledge on the left. We got over the top of the ice in one day without much problem, and summited very early the next morning. And then you would still want to expand your horizons, and this was a trip to Peru that we did in 1972, very close to the time I was finishing my diploma here for my doctorate, and again, there's amazing correlation of what was going on. And I finally learned a little bit more when I joined the cosmic ray group that you really have to work pretty hard to get things done, and it takes a lot of time to get those computer programs running that do the analysis. And finally learning, one of the things that really came from me from climbing is you have to be very self-disciplined if you want to survive in the mountains and you're trying these big routes. And I think that self-discipline that I learned there helped me a lot in the climbing world and the physics, and also in the physics world and vice versa, where I sort of instinctively understood what needed to be done in terms of what was going on in the mountains as well. So down in Peru, and unfortunately, in the time period I have, I can't get through all the wonderful cultural things that you experience when you go to a place like Peru or Russia or Europe or China. Just not enough time to talk about that, but it was wonderful to wander around, and that I wish I had a chance to talk about that a little bit more. Here's Ted Wilson, who used to be the former mayor of Salt Lake, who was on that trip. And we climbed some beautiful peaks, like did a new route on the north face of Juan Doy here, only about 800 meters of high ice, but it's ending at about 6,800 meters or so it's pretty high. Another peak we climbed, Artisan Rahu, which is appropriately named in the background, and Pyramid Day with Mike Lowe and I did a route on, and Lee Ortenberger's tent there. Lee turns out was in the same industry I was going to end up in the future, working at Sylvania. And on the face, not terribly hard climbing, just steep ice. I had enough training at this point in time. I could cope with that pretty well. Looking down on Lee coming through a cornice, a little bit of rock climbing near the top. Just a wonderful day out with a good group of friends, and Lee was chopping steps. When the rest of us, we front pointing up, that is where you just stick your crampons in the ice. He was chopping steps because he knew that we had to get down. And so, and sometimes a lot of modern climbers don't think about back. But of course, the first rule is that you come back, not that you climb the mountain, and then maybe that you come back friends. And last is you get up the mountain. And I think that's terribly important. The group sitting on the summit, Jock Glidden, who was professor of philosophy up at Weber State, on towards us, and my cousin Mike, on the background, Lee on the right, and Bert Janis, who's a physician in Salt Lake many years ago. And from there, trying to finish off that thesis, Jeff and I went up to try to the west face of the Grand Teton in the winter. This is looking up at the Grand Teton after it had been a little bit stormy, and it looked quite a bit like Patagonia. So once again, that great training that's available at pretty low cost for graduate students. But I was getting close to my doctorate, so I got really well paid as a postdoc. Looking straight down the black ice couloir on the west face of the Grand Teton. And again, the climbing is just gradually growing in complexity as I was learning in parallel in school. And by the time we got to this top, it was full-on. Weather forecasts weren't quite as good then as they are now. And so we were in a full-on storm coming down from the top and struggling actually staying on our feet when we descended through the saddle and just leaning over about this sort of angle to just try to stand up in the wind. And a pretty productive year. Also went in and climbed a new route on the north face of Mount Alberta in Canada, where we basically went up through here with Jock Glidden, and then at this really beautiful head wall. And it turns out this was just superb limestone rock climbing. And then on up here, and then way down this ridge and down the Japanese route that was done in 1928, which was one of the classic climbs in North America. Again, our first ascent, and camping before and noticing this wall in the background, and I think I left my notes in thing, but basically it goes in terms of describing the north face of North Twin, which is here in the background, is in the dank rainforest of the Canadian Rockies. There rises a wall that is so dark and gloomy that it boggles the imagination, and that was sort of, I looked at that, I'm not sure. This may have to be a postdoc project or a little bit longer. But Jock and I had a great time. One of the great things about climbing in Canada in the low angle spots, if you don't find a bivouac spot that's adequate, you can move enough rocks to get a good one under the overhang. That also means that a lot of the handholds are portable, but but we didn't find a nice spot at the top of the ice field shouldered. Above had some just brilliant rock climbing, lots and lots of fun, and enjoyed getting up through this sort of steeper section. This is the hardest part of the climb. Took 2.5 days to get up to the summit ridge, where one of those classic climbs where you have great rock climbing, great ice climbing, wonderful climbing companion who's well suited. You can talk with him, and just one of those wonderful days that you can have, or multiple days that you can have in the mountains. Well, I wasn't quite ready for North Twin at that point, so Chris Jones and Leo Tejada Flores and I went up to Canada and Alaska to try the south face of Devil's Thumb, which you can see here in the background, in 1973, again unclimbed. And it's sort of like doing research in physics. If you don't, you never know what the outcomes could be when you do an experiment, for sure. You have your hypothesis, and you've got to see if you can do it. And it's a really interesting exercise to go through in terms of prepping for these places where you go someplace new, because you have your hopes that you're going to climb the mountain, and you have your fears that you're going to get killed on the mountain, and somehow you have to make a rational decision about how to handle the situation that you're in. But we got ourselves in one of those situations, once again with bad weather, but managed to get to the top and had a interesting night out. Fortunately, they had the new fiber-filled sleeping bags, and despite the fact that we were squeezing water out of our bags in the morning to put them into the stuff sacks, and they were blocks of ice when they came out in the winter, in the evening when we get into them, they were warm. We were okay. And walked along the summit ridge, had one of those interesting experiences you don't see very often. I don't know if any of you have seen a specter of Brocken out from the outside of an airplane. I unfortunately didn't get a picture, but we were going along the summit ridge. There was fog immediately below us where you couldn't see where we were going down. Had the sun directly behind us, and we could see our shadows perfectly outlined with this beautiful rainbow around our shadows. And it's just spectacular. Well, next year, Chris Jones and I felt like we were ready for that dark, gloomy face in the Canadian Rockies. Give you a perspective about, maybe 1,500 meters of climbing, never been explored, nobody had been in there. And I finished writing my thesis on my climbs as a graduate student, was working as a postdoc. Decided I'd better push my abilities a little bit more because life is it's a lifetime learning experience. You just want to keep on getting better when you can. Now, I'm no longer getting better, but, but at that point in time I could. And so Chris and I went in to attempt it. The line we were planning to attempt would go right up here, trying to avoid all the ice fall that came off here. You can see the ice cliffs here. And there's a big, ugly area in the middle of the face where you don't want to be because lots of rocks come down. So we decided we'd better go up someplace in here, stay on the snow as much as possible, and then get on this rib that followed directly up what looked to be pretty good rock to the summit. Looking a little bit more closely at it, again, right up in this area. And actually, our first bivouac was about here, and then right on this rib. It's a little problematic how you get through these summit overhangs when you got here. We'd brought about 4 days of food and figured that would be enough. It had been a long day hike over Woolly Shoulder, and it was the first time Chris had seen it. We came over Woolly Shoulder, and you first see North Twin, and his eyes just went, whoa. By far the most serious thing I'd undertaken at that point in time. Here we're going up, and the weather isn't looking terribly good over Mount Alberta in the background, and that was sort of our weather report for the day because we didn't have a radio, we didn't have any communication with anything else. Things were a little bit different, and the weather forecasts were not good long term. So, getting ready at the base, a little bit too much debris there, but really the rock above that you can see was quite solid. When it was very, very steep, it was very, very good rock. So when Chris is getting off the ground here, climbing in mountain boots on fairly difficult terrain, it wasn't too bad. You can see his rack of protection hanging down here, and basically he'll place one of those in one of the cracks. Once he clips into it, and I'm holding the rope for him, he's not going to fall more than twice the distance he is above that first piece of protection or the second piece of protection. But it's really important from the point of view of physics that you place that first protection reasonably soon because you're going to fall double the length of the rope when you fall directly on the first person. But if you can go up 5 or 10 meters, then you have another 10 meters of stretch on that rope, and that rope will absorb a lot of the energy. So that the biggest loading on your anchor, and the most dangerous time in climbing, and why you double up on your anchors, simply has to do with the fact that you get your worst fall when you're closest to your belayer, even though it may not seem that way in terms of the loading on the rope and the amount of energy the rope can absorb. Up onto the ice field, weather's turned great, made the right decision, maybe. Found a nice place, only a few rocks dribbled down during the rock, a little tent, perfectly comfortable sleeping place, didn't even need to be tied in. It didn't look quite so good the next morning. The barometer changed again, dropped a little bit. And the climbing got more interesting because it isn't hard where it's steep. You've got really solid holds. It's hard when the coefficient of friction is really low because you have ice under your boots and you can't wear crampons, or you have ice on top of rock and you just can't tell what's going to go on. So this is actually in some ways the most dangerous part. You can't really find good places to place anchors, and you have to be extremely careful. When the rock got steeper, a little bit better, all this was a little bit loose here, was the sort of portable handhold type of terrain. And then it'd get very good. And you can see how the crack is formed here just above Chris. He can stick his hand in that crack, again expand his hand to make a cam and twist it. Gives you a very solid handhold, also placed with these newfangled camming devices. We had a few of at the time where you can stick the cam in the crack, and when you try to pull it down, it actually gets wider. And as a test for the physics students here, maybe you could derive the equation of the curve of the cam. There's a really good article on it if you can't find the answer by Dave Custer, if you look up the physics of climbing. So. And maybe I should have just left that with the professors so they could give it to you on an exam. And again, the barometer's fairly accurate, and one of the problems we were having was moving a lot slower than we'd expected because it was snowing too much, and you really have to be very, very careful when there's snow on the rock. And we got a little bit higher and the snow stopped, so things were looking good, but it was starting to get night, and we're saying, well, where in the world are we going to camp? It doesn't look very good, but if you think about it, it's pretty easy if you do a little bit of chopping to get a place where at least you can get your torsos on a ledge, and the feet were a little bit more marginal, but you also wanted to be tied in. And you see our crampons above here, the metal spikes that you put on your feet that you can actually put into the ice, provide really good support if you have solid ice. In the morning, well, didn't have to go down. The weather's obviously good. Got to go up. Took out our photos that we'd taken when we were on Mount Alberta and trying to figure out where we were on the wall in terms of route finding. A little bit of extra snow means we're going slower. Third day out, but the rock was great. Still really good rock on the steep sections. It was also getting a lot harder. This first time on a climb I'd actually ever placed a rope, which is this little tiny piton that Black Diamond makes. Chenard used to make, that's about this big, and you just drive it into incipient cracks and then stand up on it, hopefully. Chris following a fairly difficult pitch on this really good rock, and actually I think you can see the little belay or the little bivouac ledge right down here where we'd spent the previous night. And the ledges kept on getting a little bit smaller, even smaller than the night before. This night we could sort of fit two of us in the tent, but we were sort of sitting instead of lying down, sort of feet dangling off the edge. The rock continued to be quite good, but the climbing was quite a bit harder than we'd expected. And we dropped a couple of pitons, and we dropped a couple of nuts, and we started, we're up high enough now, it's not clear that we have enough gear to lower ourselves off, so it's really getting committing. And the next night was still a smaller ledge. I'm actually belaying in the morning afterwards, where we just sort of sat up completely during the night. If you're tired enough, you can sleep in that position just fine, too. Starting traversing off left towards the point where we'd hope to exit, just a little bit to the left of those summered overhangs. Again, still pretty good rock. Awesome exposure. And here you can see sort of how some of the protection goes in. I put a cam in, or a nut right here in the crack where you put it in a wide spot. It's just a block of aluminum with the sling attached. You put a carabiner through that. And again, if you fall, you're going to go only, neglecting rope stretch and things like that, you only go twice the distance that you are above that. So it's how you protect yourself, and from there I was just able to stick my fingers in the crack and do what's a lieback, which is, again, a technique where you pull like this and increase the normal force, and you get plenty of force to be able to move up. But it was looking pretty grim off to the right in terms of trying to get up there, and we figured about the only way up would be sort of directly above our heads, because those summit overhangs look pretty grim. So I went on up above our belay station here while it was storming. I got up about 60 feet, and I was almost out of gear, and it's clear we couldn't retreat at that point in time. And I got up to about, maybe 3 or 4 meters from where the ground looked quite a bit easier, but I was out of gear. And I hollered down to Chris, who had a sort of nest of pitons that weren't all that good, and I said, I need one of them. There's one little fit, and I can get up. And I was trying to stand on one foot with the foot in the crack, and my leg was beginning to cramp, and I'd had some tied off pitons were just driven a very short distance in, and you of course try to reduce the torque on them by tying them off very close to where the rock is. And Chris took it out, and I started pulling it up on the line, and I just got so tired that I had to shift feet, and when I shifted feet, I missed. And so down I came, ding, 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 and the critical piece that was in that tied-off sling. Well, the disadvantage of that is I hadn't tied it to the rope directly. It just went on that sling, and that sling came undone, and off went the critical piece down into the void. And now we're sitting here. It's getting dark. I don't think I can repeat it with the gear that I've got. We spent an interesting night trying to balance the stove on my lap while I cooked, because we lost one of the legs of the stove, trying to keep it sheltered from the wind, and thinking about this awful place we put ourselves in. But, you've got to solve these problems. So the next day I looked off to the left and I saw a little snow mushroom. It was stuck under an overhang, and there's a big ice gully here. We thought about rappelling in the ice gully, and we only had 3 ice screws, which is kind of minimal. And we had to rappel down maybe 30 meters, and it was vertical ice, and that looked a little marginal. It was pretty thin. I realized that, maybe if I put my knees on this snow patch and I pull out from underneath the overhang, I might actually be able to make progress going across this thing. And I did that, and I sort of moved out with my knees on the snow mushroom, and it didn't give way, and I managed to get a piton halfway across and continued moving across with my knees there, because there wasn't space to stand up until I finally got across the top of the runnel. And I knew that we could get off at that point. Didn't know before that. But of course, right as I got across, the storm came in with fury, and we spent another, I think, 8 pitches of ice climbing with this spindrift and hail and everything coming down the mountain on the not terribly hard ice, maybe 60 or 70 degrees. But after 5 days on the wall, that was plenty steep. Sort of what the day was like looking down on Chris. His knee was hurting, so I was leading all the pitches. And our camp on top, where we had a foot of snow, collapsed the tent during the night, had our last meal of any consequence, hoping to be able to get off, and fortunately it was chilly, and we just hoped it would give us enough gas we could get off the mountain. And this is sort of what it was like getting down. No GPS those days. We ended up down climbing a new route on a peak called Cromwell, because there was a rappel, and I remember looking up it on the way up because we couldn't find the way off in the mist. And spent another day and a half getting down, and felt really good by the time we got down to the bottom. So on to the more pleasant experiences, the cultural experience of visiting Russia in 1976. We had this era de temps. I was fortunate enough to be chosen by the American Alpine Club to go there. I had taken Russian in high school. It was a perfect situation and a real change. I'd finished my postdoc. I'd moved to California, sunny California, and went to sunny Russia, really sunny part of the time Russia. Had a great time with the Russians there, and I can't say enough for these cultural exchanges, seeing Red Square, a great welcome by the Russians, although we didn't feel very brave when we saw how the Russians were built. It's kind of like going to the Olympics and seeing how well the Russians did this year compared to us. And of course, that's one of the problems that we have with our culture, is that comparison when we rank ourselves against another culture, because it turned out the Russians were the nicest people I think I've ever climbed with, and we just had a fabulous time. They were brave fellows, and they were great fellows. We got to do some new routes, some wonderful climbing, got to see how the Russians managed to go climbing with almost minimal equipment and still do these great ascents. Here you can see typical Russian climbing gear for a master of sport at the time. So look at the size of those boots, the type of rope that he's using, and they did incredible things. And boy, in terms of drinking, we couldn't hold a candle to them. I became a very good Mormon at that point in time. Because there's no way that I was going to. So it's really easy if you just can say no. Also soloed a new ice route over in this area here on a peak called Free Korea Peak, which is kind of an interesting name. coming out of the Cold War. Had great relationships with the Russians. Here's Henry Barber getting a little bit of help from some of the local women. And trying to further international relations the best he could. And camaraderie. Great party group. And they really were great people. And I think one of the lessons that's come from my international experience is that, all people, despite our different tribes, were the same. And I think that of all the things I've learned of my climbing experiences, that maybe is the most important. Well, going up to continuing my education, I'd moved to California at this point in time and gone to work for Bill Perry, who was eventually the Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton at a place called ESL. A great place to work. I learned an enormous amount from working it there. And so, but there also, Bill was pretty understanding and letting his employees have that flexibility. And I was very fortunate in the career that I went through that I was able to take these long time periods off. Here was about 2 weeks. And I would typically go very intensely, just like I work, very intensely go climbing for 2 or 3 weeks, and later a month-long or 2-month-long trips to the Himalayas. And then you really have to dig out when you get back to work. But I think if you can manage to deliver enough in the time period that you were at work, you'll come out okay. But you have to have an understanding employee. That is not a standard relationship. But I was very, very fortunate that I was able to establish a reputation fairly early as being a moderate contributor and working hard. One nice thing about going there, I'd separated from my spouse and gotten divorced, but my daughter was living in Alaska. And this is Cara, at age 5 or so, and it's wonderful to spend some time with her before going up on the mountain. And Jeff Lowe had found this route on Mount Foraker, which we were later to call the Infinite Spur. It's about 2,800 meters of climbing, pretty big, on the second highest peak in the Alaska range. And so we headed in to Hilton International Airport. Here, Jeff Lowe, a little bit more mature at this point in time. And Michael Kennedy, who has been the editor of Alpinist in recent years, a really good friend. I was actually out ski touring with him just a few weeks ago. And again, that's one of the beauties of the climbing community. It's small enough, you meet these people, you get to love them, they're friends for life. And initially, we wanted to warm up a little bit on the unclimbed north face of Mount Hunter here, tried this buttress, got pretty high on it. You can now see how the crampons are used to stick into the ice axe above, a little bit of mixed climbing here. I think Michael is about to put a piece in there, or at least I hope he is. But then it turned in this awful cornice ridge, and Jeff headed out on the ridge and got about 40 feet out, and all of a sudden there was this, and the cornice went away. And Jeff went down about 30 feet and pulled the rest of us along the ridge part of the way because we didn't have any really good anchors there. But it was one of these places where you'd drape back and forth and nobody was going to come off. He said, I think I broke my ankle. And he had indeed broken his ankle, so we splintered it. We lowered him down, took another day and a half to get him off the mountain. And now we were down to a party of 2, and do we want to try this thing? Well, we decided we better go up and try to give it a try. So instead of going on the cornice the second time when Michael and I actually climbed it, you can see our tracks going across the side, and that's a lot easier than going along this top of this awful cornice ridge. Did the route, and then the decision is, do we want to go into Foraker? Well, do we want to climb the Cassin Ridge on Denali, which is a lot easier? And we finally, it's that hope versus fear, and how do you make a rational decision? We thought, well, we won't know unless we go try it. You just don't know. And so we decided to go in. Again, the route is going up this buttress here, pretty well protected from the ice fall on both sides, so it's a reasonably safe, objective route getting up to the summit, but a long ways to go. Great mixed climbing on the early, really wonderful granite down low. Here Michael's following up a just fabulous pitch Weather's a little manky, but it's not snowing. Really good cracks to protect yourself. Rock climbing wasn't terribly hard. First bivouac spot, good place to place the tent. A little tiny tent, but a very comfortable place to hang out once you've spent enough time doing this sort of thing. You get used to it. We'd built some special purpose stoves where basically you have an outer shell that directs the heat around the pot, and also so much more thermodynamically efficient than the regular pots where the wind can disturb them quite a bit. And it also keeps the flame away from any flammable materials inside your tent. And that sort of thing just wasn't available at that time. Gas usage goes way down, which means you don't have to carry as much weight. Great rock climbing. Bivouacs get worse. Long, not very hard ice slope going upwards. Weather gets worse. Up into harder climbing. It's midnight. We're sort of been climbing for 24 hours already. Totally exhausted. I wanted bivouac there. Michael said, I don't think we should do this. I said, I can't lead it. And he said, okay, I'll lead it. And he managed to get up this quite difficult mixed pitch, and other people who've been a little smarter than us found a better way around later years. And here's following that pitch. And onto quite a nice bivouac when the weather cleared. Or we could actually chop. It took a few hours to get it to this point because we were chopping for quite a bit of time, but we spent about 12 hours just recuperating there. And then on up this ridge, and it was a long ways up this. This is probably a kilometer across here because you couldn't see that there was a horizontal section. You just went along the side of it for a long time. Not terribly steep, but steep enough you had to watch things. And finally, getting close to the last pitch, and Michael at this point in time was exhausted, and it was my turn to take over the lead, and it's just sort of the thing about a perfect partnership where you can just support each other when you need it, and as a team do far better than you could do on your own. Sort of mind-blowing experience. Spent another 24 hours in a Fortunately, right after we got to the hanging glacier near the top, big storm came in. Must have been 100-mile-an-hour winds, but we were sheltered, no problem. Would not have been nice if we'd been lower. Then hiking up towards the top, and I think it's the coldest I've ever been climbing, where you're full-on down clothing all over, moving uphill, not technically difficult, so continuously moving together, and I was cold. Arriving triumphantly on the summit. And then that long way down. Went down the northeast ridge. Another 24-hour storm on the way down. But all in all, a great experience, and the weather turned good, so we could fly out the day after we got there. And Jeff was already back in the lower 48. They splintered him up and sent him home, and so we ended up having a great experience, Mount Denali in the background. So that team of people was pretty good. In '78, we hadn't been to the Himalayas. I'd read Eric Shipton's book, Blank on the Map, where they'd explored this area, the Karakoram first. I'd seen this picture of the north ridge of Latak 1. And here you're looking, this peak is 23,300, which is 7,300 meters or something like that. And it's about somewhere in the ballpark of 8,000 or 9,000 feet up the ridge, so it's a long ways vertically. I'd seen the pictures in the blank on the map and some other research I'd done and got a permit to go in there. Got some pictures of the other side of the mountain. This is not an easy mountain. This is the south side taken by Galen Rao when they were going in to reconnoiter K2. Give me a little bit of perspective of what the south side looks like. And we added Jim Danini, who's climbed with last summer. Still climbing with because we felt we needed a party of 4 for an undertaking this serious. And of course, we weren't taking Sherpas. Sherpas cannot handle this sort of technical terrain. And we took my dad along as a physician, which was really a wonderful experience. The hike in is over incredibly dry terrain. It's amazing people are able to live there. They have irrigation systems, what keeps them alive. You can see what it looks like where you can bring the water from above. This is a part of Pakistan that I think I'd still be willing to go back despite the problems we had on Nanga Parbat, with the climbers getting slaughtered there. The people in Baldistan in general are incredibly hospitable, and they were when we were there. And the interesting thing about walking in here is you can be suffering from heat stroke when you're walking on the terminal moraine of a glacier. It gets very hot in the summer. It took about 3 or 4 days to get into base camp from there. Here we camped with our meager 2 small tents that were to go on the mountain with us, and 1 tent for our Sirdar, or liaison officer, I should say, from the Pakistani Army. And we just intended to go up this ridge. At that point in time, that sort of thing hadn't really been done in the Himalaya. And in fact, still hasn't been done very much. We just tried to go up the snow initially and we couldn't haul the bags up, and the rocks started coming down when the sun came out. So I got out on the rock, and again, you can see my application of climbing techniques. That hand is jammed in that crack. Very, very secure. It's much better than doing this because you can put everything on bone and tendon instead of muscles. That means you don't get tired. Difficult rock climbing. And we'd have 2 people climbing and 2 people carrying loads. We carried about 17 days of food, which is an enormous load. We sort of tried to go capsule style. We took about 8 ropes, and we'd put ropes up one day and then haul the gear up the ropes the next day, usually with a lead team going ahead. Here Jeff Lowe's going up on these mechanical ascenders that go up, sort of designed to go up a rope and not slide down it. I don't know whether Peter Gibbs is in the room, but he made some better versions for icy conditions many years ago. Great bivouac spot. The weather's wonderful. A little scary on the edge of the cornice there, though. And it's hot. We're at about 6,000 meters, or a little bit over 6,000 meters, and it's hot during the day. But of course, the next day it's not hot. And in fact, we got just a little bit higher and spent 6 days of not hot, wondering about whether we could go up further, and it just stormed and stormed and stormed and stormed, and we just could not move. Probably a couple of meters of snow fell, and the Karakoram weather is pretty unstable. But then the weather clears. We got a beautiful place for camping. Still some nice climbing to be done above, although the cornices were a little bit scary to be under. See the crew going across. Steep ice, but solid anchors. You can drive an ice screw, these little things with tubes. They weren't quite as easy to drive in those days. They weren't nearly as sharp, but we were able to get them in. And again, you see the use of the ice hammer and the ice axe to hold you in place. And the next place became a little more problematic. And where do we find a campsite? Well, a little bit of shoveling. You can do a lot of good things. You probably want to stay roped in, though. Getting moderately high on the mountain now. Great mixed climbing. I mean, not really hard, but pushing us all the time. You can see where the previous campsite was right here, and where we sort of poked our head over hoping to get up on this low-angle snow ridge, but it's kind of sharp on top. Not a good place to go. Coming up some steep ice. And this is one of the more difficult leads on the climb because it was not all that great a rock, and you were having to stand on very thin ice over sort of crumbly rock and make mixed moves. And you can't swing the ice axe hard because you're just dulling on the rock underneath you. So you just have to tink it in and find a good placement and move slowly up. And I felt pretty pressed on this one. And then on some really brilliant climbing where you have this thin ice over granite slabs, really good rock. And I can just remember Jeff Lowe up there leading this overhang. He says, "God, this is so much fun." And of course, what is a rational definition of fun? Is sitting down in your lab working on a computer program at midnight and seeing that it works and seeing you get results out. Is that fun? Well, maybe for a physicist, maybe not for other people. And climbing, I guess, falls in the same sort of class. Up higher on the Cornice Ridge. Problem is we're sort of running out of time. We'd now gone about 18 days because the weather had been so bad. And Jim Denny was really tired. We had to chop out a bivouac spot, which you can see here. It's a little exposed at probably around almost 7,000 meters. Exposed out from the night, looking down, and I put a couple of rope planks up with Michael Kennedy. Above there, you can see all the way down the ridge we'd climbed so far, down to the glacier. And above there, the climbing still was hard. I'd fixed the ropes that were in place are the ones that I'd fixed the night before. And then on this beautiful, shiny water ice, it was not all that difficult because it had enough air from being sort of glacier ice earlier. Pretty reasonable climbing. On the first flat place we'd seen where we could actually pitch the tents completely. And better still, we could build a snow cave. And we were probably only 200 meters from the top at that point of the whole mountain. But unfortunately, the weather was coming in over a peak called the Ogre, and it was very clear that a big storm was coming. In the meantime, Michael Kennedy and I put up, in the beginning of the storm, we finished the last hard rock pitch, got up, got some good anchors in, got back down. Jeff and Jim had dug a beautiful snow cave, and we settled in and figured, well, the storm will end shortly, and we go to the summit. So we hauled into the snow cave, completely sheltered from the storm. Not very much food left, a little bit of old Pakistani chicken soup, and the reason we still had that, it was practically inedible, and some old Pakistani sausage that when you'd squeeze it in the sun, it would ooze grease. And it was, at that altitude, you don't absorb grease all that well, and it's really critical to stay fueled so you can keep climbing because you use an enormous number of calories each day, which is why the fat is in theory good, but your body starts rejecting it at that altitude. Spent 2 days in the snow cave, went back out and said, you know, we got to make it, the storm was not quite as bad, we got to make a push for the summit. And Michael and I went up ahead, and Jim and Jeff started following, and we got up another pitch to where we'd gotten over what we thought were most of the difficulties. It was really clear that Jeff wasn't functioning right. Something was wrong. He just wasn't moving, and so we said, you know, we're going to have to go back down the snow cave, and we just don't have enough supplies left to make another summit attempt. Michael and I probably could have gone to the top, but you know, the point of this thing when you're climbing with a team is you do it as a team. And if Jeff is not functioning well, if we got hurt, you know, there's no way we could get off the mountain, and you have to get back down. So we spent a grim couple of days in the snow cave. You can see how Jim's feeling. And Jeff was far worse. You can see how blue his face was, really hypoxic, very sick. Jeff hasn't done traditionally well at altitude, but he'd been fine up to that point. He'd been really sick earlier in the trip, as you know, good Pakistan, you'll get sick, especially in the mountains. And we really wondered whether we'd get him off. But after 2 more days, we were out of food, we were almost out of fuel, and we had to go down. And so off we went into the storm, not knowing what would happen. Got down, just storming madly the entire day. Got down to a ledge, spent a night out, totally exposed, and I was in a bivouac sack with the remains of our tent, really, with Jim Denny, and I thought, you know, Jeff's going to be dead in the morning. And I called over and I said, Michael, how's Jeff? And Jeff said, I feel great. Because we'd been lowering him all day. And he didn't have a pack, and maybe that helped a little bit. So We continued rappelling for 2 more days in the storm, still lowering Jeff that second day down until finally on the 4th day of rappelling, about 80 rappels later, the sun came out. We're rappelling down over the bottom granite buttress, and things were just wonderful. But we obviously couldn't have hung around at the top. But as I come back and look back at where we got to on the mountain, maybe people had climbing here, we did it, but we didn't get to the summit. The old hypothesis was not satisfied in terms of what we wanted to get done, and it still hasn't been done. I think that there have been something like 25 attempts since we tried it. And we were really lucky that we had the right people, the right team, maybe not quite the right time, but we really gave it our best, and we came back really good friends. So going on to Everest, and I'm going to have to get going faster because I'm running out of time. Got invited to go to do the unclimbed east face of Mount Everest, through Tibet, Kachung Face, place that Mallory said others less wise might go there, but it certainly was not for us when he had reconnoitered back in 1921. But the neat thing about this is you get to go through Lhasa, the Okan Cathedral. We got to see it before all the tourists were there, before there were any tourists in Lhasa. Fantastic experience, which I could talk about for several hours. But on into Everest and the east face, and it's pretty clear why, with the ice cliffs lining the east face, why people didn't climb it. We had a long debate in 1981, and I advocated very strongly for this route going up this way. Some other people were advocating for a route that would go up this way until they saw the ice avalanche come off here that covered up to here and came out to base camp with the dust cloud that was about 10 kilometers away. So the route became noted. The nice thing about this, we had a superb expedition leader in the form of Jim Morris. He was a cardiac surgeon in Stockton, California, really kept the team together. On our first attempt, Sir Edmund Hillary came in with us. Amazing man. Great advice in terms of mountaineering. Some other people wanted to go try the north face of Everest when it was clear this one was going to be pretty difficult. And he said, this is the last unclimbed face on the highest mountain on earth. How can you give this up? Okay, Ed. And we had a really great group of people. We still get together every 5 years for a reunion. One of the faculty members at the University of Utah, Jeff Tabin, who's up at the Moran Eye Center, runs the Himalayan Cataract Project, probably has saved 30,000 people's vision over the past 10 years. So a really good group of people. Difficult climbing again, no Sherpas, partly because I have real ethical hang-ups with trying to use Sherpas to take the risks that Saabs are not willing to take and pay them a minimal amount per day, partly because it was technically too difficult for them to go, but I really feel strongly that you can't put other people's lives at risk when you're not willing to take the same risks yourselves, and certainly not unless they want to do as a member of a climbing team, which is a very different thing. It's been interesting climbing up through the ice mushrooms here, and we're looking at a fully 3,000 meter high face here, getting up to 8,800 meters, so it's pretty high. Along the side of the ice mushrooms up to this wonderful place we call the bowling alley, because when the sun came up in the morning, it was not a good place to be. On up to Pinsetter Camp, where we watched the rocks go over our heads, fortunately pretty sheltered by the rock overhang above. You can see a rope thing, and we'd actually tried to put a mechanical pulley in place, which we'd done lower in the mountain. Didn't work very well with a motor drive, but here you can see ropes going up, and Dave Cheeseman, who's another engineer and a physicist, got together and said, geez, we look up there, there's a lot of snow and rock at the top of this head wall. We were down somewhere in this area here, and lots of snow and rock up there, and I'd kind of like to trade that that potential energy for the potential energy in the packs that are down with all the loads in it. So Dave Cheeseman and I managed to, after we got up the thing, put up a pulley system. But in the meantime, this is leading the crux pitch on the first attempt. This is rock is schist. At this point in time, we'd had really good granite down lower, but you go from schist and then limestone. And schist, in this case, you could take out of a cup of consonants and come up with a good description of the type of rock it is. There were cracks about every foot this far, and you could drive a piton almost any place, and that was the problem. Fortunately, there were a few dikes going through. I'm actually on a dike here, but I can remember when I was able to place a good piton here. But I literally would sometimes reach down to try to pull my sling out that I was standing on, and I'd pull the piton out with the aid sling. It was a pretty scary place to be, and steep. Coming down. But hanging out where we put the pulley system in, just great. We brought up 1 bottle of oxygen and per person. If you could carry your bottle to high camp, you could go to the summit. If you couldn't, you couldn't. And that was the rule. So that's the way we set things up. We hauled all the things up there. There's the pulley system in work. Went up through the place we call Jaws. And then the upper part of the mountain is really easy. It's a walk in the sky, as Nick Clinch might have said. The problem with the walk in the sky is you look at the physics of it and you ask about what your basal oxygen, this is what you need to stay alive, lying down flat in bed, and you ask what happens at sea level. This is what the 1981 expedition actually measured, and you're on the summit of Everest. You don't move very fast when you're that far above basal metabolism. But a nice walk in the snow, beautiful place, going up the Hillary Step. I was amazed at what Ed had done back in 1953. Pretty hard. I actually ran into a Japanese team that climbed the regular route, except this was taken when they were going up and our team was going down, the first team. And the first group on the top, my team had been first, and one of our members got pulmonary edema, went down okay, and then we were the second team. So here's Kim Mom on the summit with a hand-sewn Chinese flag because we'd forgotten to bring one. And my partner's Dan Reed, Jay Cassell heading up towards the summit the next day. I lost them in the night. I'd start out about an hour before they'd figured I'd break trail, and the mist came in. I couldn't see the tent. Might as well go up. Going up and seeing all these things I'd read about in the books, reading Hornbein's book about the West Ridge and this glorious literature about Everest, and seeing it all was just wonderful. Great day. And here's the only picture. I don't have a picture of myself on the summit. This is coming down that the others took. And here's what the team looks like on the way out. It's a great weight loss program. It's also, that group of people will be my friends forever. As I look back on it, I think that's the thing I take back from that trip that was the best. We got along incredibly well. Just a great group of men. From there, I went on to try to climb K2. Brought along a very strong woman who take across the creeks. Alex Lowe, very strong. Got high on the mountain, over 8,000 meters. I got pulmonary edema, recognized it, went down. Alex and Steve Swenson saw the storm was coming in, went down. The storm came in. It killed 13 people on the other side. Time to go down. You got to come back. Went to Dalagary on my honeymoon, crossing some of the creeks, seeing a little bit of the culture. Great place to go around the west side of Dalagary. Got into base camp, filthy place. We ruined the place, human feces all over. I mean, it was really disturbing seeing what had happened in a place that's supported by these big expeditions. When I got there, everybody else was sick. Ended up going with Nuru Chopra, high on the mountain. He didn't want to climb it, so he took this last photo of me. Here's the top. Had to be there alone. That was not a nice way to climb the mountain. And I've sort of kept it up since. That's sort of the culmination of my Himalayan climbing. But I've tried to stay active since. I've tried to stay active at work, climbing the nose of El Cap with Alex Lowe in a day back in the 90s. Greatest day I've ever had in the mountains. His enthusiasm. But young kids keep you at home. Skiing the North Twin, as a matter of fact. Oops. The Canadian Rockies, trying to stay physically active, trying to stay mentally active at work. Interesting ski terrain in the Rockies. Going up to Lotus Flower Tower in Canada, a great, beautiful climb in the 50 Classics. Just climbing knobs for 1,000 meters. It's just fantastic. Or climbing in the Bugaboos with Joe Terravecchia flying up there in my airplane. Great climb on the west side of Westhauser Tower. Climbing El Cap in 2006 with Conrad Anker, trying to do the Salathé Wall in a day, which had taken me 5.5 days in 1969. We didn't quite make it. It was 33 hours. But climbing in the Dolomites. And one of the keys is, I think, is if you can continue doing these things as you move, as you get older, you can it comes naturally. And I intend to keep on climbing forever, backpacking with my daughters as they got older, canyoneering, getting grandchildren. And all these things I've been really fortunate to participate in. But still get out in the mountains. Here's some climbing up in the Cascades on the Price Glacier, Mount Shuxlin. Worst hazard that we have had in recent years is crossing this log bridge and thrashing through the Devil's Club. And a little bit of climbing up on the Grand Wall in Squamish Chief, or skiing last winter on the Haute Route. But the key of all these things in my mind in terms of what my climbing career and in really in some sense my work career is that if you put what you put into it, you get out of it. And you can balance these things to some extent. But the most important thing is the things that we saw in the International Climbers Meet a couple of years ago is the friendship that you can build across the nations and the friends that you keep from these experiences that you've gone through over the years. And I think that's the critical thing that I have gotten out of my climbing experience, maybe not quite so much in physics, but that you really do, with the physics part, whatever you put into it, you will get out of it. And so I've been very, very fortunate to stay healthy enough, both mentally and physically, to still be working in not physics anymore, but in engineering, and still being able to get out climbing. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if people have them. I know I ran over my time, but that's the nature of the projects I work on, I'm afraid, since I work for the government. So people have questions? Well, it was interesting. I actually was trying to work, if you hang a chain from, or a wire from 2 points, and I was trying to work out the equation of that when I was at about 6,500 meters on Latok, and I just couldn't do it. It's a relatively simple equation that you can derive pretty straightforward, but I just try to do it so I didn't really think very much about the physics, and climbing when you're at really high altitude, your brain isn't functioning very well because your PO2 level is so low, and so if you don't react instinctively and solving mathematical problems, when I was trying to calculate my oxygen flow rate going to the summit of Everest, I totally blew it. I had an enormous amount of oxygen left when I got down to the top camp because I couldn't calculate the simple equation, the volume you use is equal to the flow rate times the amount of time, and this is not very hard to do. So in general, it was obviously very focused on climbing, but I try to do the same thing when I'm doing the engineering work, that I try to focus intensively on that. Well, I'm glad somebody passes that kind of lie about me around. It makes for a much better story. I don't remember that, but I don't remember a lot of things. I've only used oxygen once, and that was going to the summit of Everest from a little bit over 8,000 meters. And I felt like I could have done it without it because the oxygen apparatus right now is much lighter than it was then. Of course, Hillary had still heavier. But I felt like the key for oxygen for me is one, is it made me not be able to convert Laplace transforms, but at least be able to think a little bit more clearly. And two, it kept me warm. And so you're working harder, and I think in terms of physical effort expended, I don't think I was only using a liter per minute. And that isn't enough to it's probably about balances off the weight of the extra weight of the oxygen in the pack. But if you're thinking clearly, that really increases your safety margin. And if you're warm, it's nice to come back with all your extremities. I think the climb we did on Latok, even though we didn't get to the summit, was the best climb that I've ever done.
Not necessarily the most technically.
It was technically probably equivalently demanding, and certainly if you consider the altitude, probably more demanding. And it was continuously difficult for the entire distance. I mean, there were basically no easy sections. And it was never really incredibly hard. I think for a most enjoyable day in the mountains, it was the day I did the nose with Alex Lowe, because the feeling of moving that fast on this huge expanse of stone with a climbing companion who's just showing infectious joy being there. I mean, it was just incredible. Nose of El Capitan in Yosemite Valley. So that's at about 1,000-meter high climb, and I did that in the 90s, early 90s.
And then what was your favorite route? What's your favorite route from Little Cottonwood? If you could pick one. If you were forced to pick one.
You'd have to force me to pick one. There's so many good climbs in Little Cottonwood. Probably either the fin or the S-crack with the upward direct finish on the thumb. Well, I was always interested in science. It was the thing I was best at, and I liked it. It was just interesting problem solving. I liked it, and climbing in some sense was the same. My uncle had introduced me when I was about 10 years old, when he was, Jeff climbed the Grand Teton when he was 7 years old. And he blamed his dad when he did it. Not that he could have held a fall. So his dad introduced us a little bit, and there were these crazy people going rock climbing in Southern California, and that got me out of the smog of Southern California. And I just went out with them, and it turned out to be one of the few things I was actually good at physically. Because, if you ask for about team sports, the position I played was left out. I think I'd rather be known as a really good engineer, physicist, than as a really good climber. And one of the problems with doing a career of both is you're probably not quite as good at either. Because there's a limited amount of energy you can put into things.
Looks like you had a good time with that.
Well, I intend to continue having a good time. Yes. My children. I'm very proud of them. I think it was a situation on North Twin when we were sitting there not knowing we couldn't go down, we didn't have enough gear, and it wasn't clear how we could get up. It wasn't clear how we were going to solve that problem. It was a pretty miserable night. But we knew we were going to try.
So before we end, the department wanted to give you what we call the key to the Wasatch.
Oh, thank you.
I think you'd enjoy it.
Thank you very much.
So-
I really appreciate it. I really appreciate, you know, she has done an incredible job of making the arrangements for me. So thank you very much, Kathleen.
You're too kind.
I mean, I can't say how much I've appreciated it.
Thanks.
And how nice it's been to see a lot of my old friends here, and it's really great to see some of you who are still teaching, and you know, who are still teachers then, and that's just fabulous. So thank you for allowing me to visit.